Hi, everybody, and welcome again to Journalism 101, Critical Analysis of the Mass Media, the online version, with your course instructor, Dr. Paul Trout. This week we talk about advertising and public relations. And this is a topic very close to my heart because my first job after receiving a bachelor's degree in broadcasting and film from the University of Colorado was to work as a copywriter and a producer of television and radio commercials at a small, what was then known as creative boutique advertising agency. And I did that for about a year. And I really had no inclination or desire to move into the field of advertising, although I had had some advertising courses. But it's because I had had some scripting and had production training and knew a little bit about audiences and had studied communication and persuasion and a number of the things that are reviewed in this chapter. I had the raw skills necessary to basically be able to move my interest in public affairs and news over into the making of TV and radio spots. And it put bread on the table for over a year, and it was an incredible experience. And I know that many of you in this class are thinking about careers in public relations or advertising, what have now become known collectively as integrated marketing communications. And so I think you'll find this chapter interesting. And it's a large chapter with lots of material, historical, psychological, strategic, that kind of thing involved. And I just really want to touch base in these two videos on some of the major points. So here, let's go. There's an old story in the advertising business called Release the Condor. And the story goes that back in the 60s, when there were these huge multi-service advertising agencies, and they still exist, but not in the same way. And one of these large outfits was producing a car commercial for one of the large automobile manufacturers out of Detroit. And they had envisioned through their copy services and their creative services this idea of a bird soaring in flight, and they were going to do montage segues to this automobile that was sitting on top of a large mesa out here somewhere in the great Southwest. And the idea was that they were going to show this bird, cut away to the car, go back to the bird, and so on and so forth. So they have hundreds of people involved in this production. They move this entire production crew from LA out into the desert over a weekend. They have the bird handlers ready to go. And at the crack of dawn one day, the producer and the director are sitting at the bottom of this mesa. They have the cameras rolling, and through walkie-talkies they say, "Release the condor." And the bird handlers off camera throw this bird up into the sky, and they're filming this as this bird flaps its wings and falls 250 feet to the bottom of the desert floor and implodes itself in the process. Because no one had stopped long enough to figure out whether or not condors could actually fly or fly that way. And it just spoke to the large, phantasmagorical, over-budget expenses that went into television production and the shooting of commercials way back when. And none of it happens that way anymore. Sure, there are big production spots, there are big production commercials that are cut, but they never happen without considerable audience research, strategic planning, committee input, product testing, focus group interviews, platform testing, research involved in testing a number of potential creative platforms, brand analysis, competition analysis, and it just goes on and on and on. This has become a highly refined area of applied research, even the creative components. And as I teach in my advertising creativity class, we don't write a word of copy in that class until we have done extensive research on the client and their competition and the product category and the product category climate and what's going on with brands in that business in this day and age. So this is an interesting fusion of research and creativity, and I think it's a fascinating area of the field. So release the condor is the old way of saying that what can go wrong will go wrong in the advertising business, but it also speaks to the changes that have occurred in the last 25 or 30 years and how advertising increasingly has to pay attention to very, very sophisticated research before any commercial is ever produced or written or aired. So you're going to have some exposure in this chapter to advertising, which is paid exposure and the traditional means of paying for mass information, news, and entertainment. In other words, advertising for the longest time in this country paid for mass media in this country. And you know this is the case having read about David Sarnoff, who decided to sponsor programming through the sale of advertising, sponsorship of programming back in the late 1920s. This is the system we have in this country. It is not like this in many other countries where there are other means, often through public funding of television and radio, even newspapers and other traditional media, where advertising doesn't play such a central role. But that is our model in this country. You're also going to read about public relations in this chapter, which is different. It's not paid exposure, but it's earned exposure through the creation of news and information, sometimes pseudo events or whatever, in order to try to get your client and their product and services into the minds of potential consumers of that product or service. So public relations is somewhat different from advertising, in that you're trying to create exposure with the goal of increasing awareness for your product or service, ultimately your client. Since this has become more and more integrated, you are now seeing, and this is also reflected not just in the industry, but in academic programs like our own, where we no longer have departments of advertising or departments of public relations, although those still exist. What we now have increasingly are things like departments or sequences in IMC, integrated marketing communication, because everything is seen as meshed together. And so students who pursue this kind of training increasingly are being provided this integrated approach to understanding all the needs and services that a client might have and being able to do all of those. So those are some basic terms and trends. I want you to watch the second video where I'm going to talk more about some of the specific aspects of the industry and things that you might pay attention to and things that you will pursue as often as their own unique courses as you move forward into our IMC sequence, indeed, for those of you who are interested in doing that.